My name is Tim Leistikow. My candidate number is 12345. Today I will be talking about an extract from The Great Gatsby. In this extract from early in the novel, Fitzgerald explores the way the narrator, Nick Carraway, is straddling multiple worlds and how that impacts his views on those around him. Fitzgerald uses this to explore the theme of the past, as well as the theme of the American dream. He does this through diction that emphasizes the tension of being caught between two worlds, as well as through his use of imagery that highlights the peril of attempting to live up to the belief that one's value is based on one's material worth. Rather than starting at the beginning of this extract, I want to start at line 12, examining what I think is the most critical part of this passage, and maybe the most critical, one of the most critical parts of the novel. Nick says, the narrator Nick says, "I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life." First and foremost, Fitzgerald's diction is very lyrical. It's very poetic. Usually, when thinking, to oneself, words like enchanted, repelled, inexhaustible variety seem a little dramatic, which I think is the point here, is to show that Nick is aware of the drama in this moment. And that moment being specifically, he is in Myrtle Wilson's apartment that is owned by Tom Buchanan, who is the cousin of his, or the husband of his cousin Daisy Buchanan. So it's, I think, a little dramatic in that sense, that he's with his cousin's husband's mistress. But more importantly, I think Nick is starting to sense that the world that he thinks he understands is maybe not exactly the one that he thought he understood, and that kind of connects to his father's advice to him that not everyone has had the same privileges that you've had, so you need to be aware of that when meeting other people. And so Nick comes predisposed, as he tells us at the very beginning of the book, to kind of withhold judgment. I guess I should back up and say that the really interesting thing about Nick as a narrator is that he is telling us this story from the future. So literally this story that he's telling us is one of the past. And so to have Nick reflecting on this moment from his past, where he's able to say, "I was within and without," and it's interesting because he's within this passage in the novel, but he's also without of this passage in the novel because he's back reflecting on it wherever he's writing the novel. And he's simultaneously enchanted and repelled. And so he knows what's going to happen. He knows that Tom and Daisy and Gatsby and he and Jordan will go to the hotel in New York, that things will get heated, and that Daisy and Gatsby will leave, and that Gatsby will, or that Daisy rather, will hit Myrtle Wilson and kill her. And so I think part of that here is him saying, I look back on this and I'm enchanted by the power of this whole experience that I had, but I'm also repelled by what I know is going to come from this, and then finally the inexhaustible variety of life. Again, showing us that Nick, by his own admission, although it's difficult with a first-person narrator, especially one that's biased to a certain extent because they're narrating from the past, it's difficult to trust Nick all the time, but it seems like Nick is really wanting to assume the best about people. So I think this one sentence within this passage really tells us a lot about both that tension that Fitzgerald's emphasizing throughout this through word choice, like within and without, enchanted, repelled. It's that push and the pull that Nick's feeling as our narrator, as a character in this novel, and then as we feel as readers. And I think part of it too is going back to that idea that Nick is narrating from the past, so a lot of this is heavy on foreshadowing. If we go to the first line, she really ought to get away from him. Catherine, Myrtle's sister, is stating that it would be better for Myrtle to get away from Tom. Now, obviously Catherine doesn't know that Tom's going to wind up leading to Myrtle's death, but that's a clear foreshadowing, just as line 24, where Myrtle is talking to Nick about the first time she met Tom, she ends that story by saying, "You can't live forever, you can't live forever." And of course, that is very true, because in meeting Tom, Myrtle does seal her her death, not too much after that they start dating. I also think, though, that that's a great example of this tension of being within and without, because Myrtle saying you can't live forever, you can't live forever is, I think, a very clear allusion to the dream that Gatsby has for he and Daisy, that obviously Nick is very influenced by in this novel. This idea that you can repeat the past, you can make the world what you want it to be, but as Myrtle states here, eventually that will die. You can't live forever. The other really interesting piece of foreshadowing that's kind of subtle is on line 10, Nick, before he gives us that line of saying he's within and without, notices that there's a line of yellow windows, which of course corresponds nicely with the line the yellow car makes as it hits Myrtle. And so in some ways this passage, I think, really does demonstrate that no matter how much fun you're having in the moment, which, there's a lot of imagery of drinking, of having a good time. In fact, we're told on line 4 that they've consumed at least one bottle of whiskey, and now we're on to the second one. There's descriptions of these really, what does he say, celebrated sandwiches. So we're having a good time. Things are going great. Unfortunately, as evidenced by these references to Myrtle's death, those will come to a pretty impactful end. And on that note, if we look at line 45 and kind of continuing along that way of foreshadowing and how Fitzgerald is letting us know that in this scene, which again occurs early in the novel, that things are going to end abruptly and tragically. Line 45 starts with, and before I read it, I think it's really interesting because up until this point we're very caught up in Fitzgerald's typical style, which is descriptive and lyrical, and the paragraph before has this great diction of tension, of being pulled in different directions. He says people disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, then lost each other, searched for each other, found each other. So it's very flowing and very typical of Fitzgerald and obviously Nick's narration. And then all of a sudden on line 45, making a short, deft movement, just the diction, the sound of those two words, rather, not the diction, the sound of those two words, just the way that they're so clipped versus everything else. They mirror Tom Buchanan breaking her nose with that quick movement of his hand, and again, similar to the short, deft movement of the car hitting Myrtle, we have this clear foreshadowing throughout the passage that things are not going to go well. Back to Fitzgerald's use of imagery as a way to understand the American dream. Throughout this passage, we have examples of lavishness, whether it's there's the idea of having people deliver food to you and the drinking and whatnot, but also specific things like the description of Tom's clothing and Miss McKee telling Myrtle that she's going to give her a dress, and then Mrs. McKee listing off all these things she's going to do that are these images of wealth and prosperity, which again get really slapped away from us in that last line. Interestingly enough, the moment right after the extract ends is Tom apologizing and trying to make it up to Myrtle that he has obviously reminded her of where she comes from, in the sense that she can do anything she wants except remind Tom. Of course, the reason he breaks her nose is that she reminds Tom that her wife's name is Daisy, and so it's like Tom basically saying, as long as we don't mention my past, as long as we don't drift, out of this present moment, everything will be fine. But the minute she does, the minute that the past comes in, Tom breaks that tension by literally breaking her nose. And even though this passage does not include Jay Gatsby and really doesn't include a lot of Nick other than him observing, it falls right in line with one of the themes of the novel, that Nick is so devastated by the fact that in all of the hope he holds for mankind that his father's helped him to create through the way he was raised, that by the time we get to the end of this novel, Nick's hope to a certain extent is going to be destroyed, just like Myrtle's, that he will be unable to get past the current, as the famous last line state. You can just turn it on, because it would be, obviously you know that I'm coming to my conclusion. That Nick cannot overcome the current, just like Myrtle can't overcome Tom breaking her nose and reminding her that this is not her life. Nick can't get out of the fact that the past happened, and that tension of wanting to both be part of it but be away from it is impossible for him to get past, just like this belief that you can somehow redefine who you are based on whether it's material possessions or some idea of the past is impossible to do as well. There we go.